The billowing clouds of grit kicked up by the retreating wagon wheels had barely begun to settle before the silence of the wilderness rushed in to fill the void. Sarah stood paralyzed, the scream she wanted to unleash dying in her throat as the last connection to her former life vanished into the horizon. She was a solitary figure anchored to the permafrost, a single wooden trunk the only witness to her displacement. Before her loomed a cabin. Weather-beaten, silvered by age, and hunkered down against the landscape like a sentry. To her eyes, it looked less like a shelter and more like a tomb. A biting February gale ripped through the thin fabric of her wool shawl, stinging her skin like 1,000 needles. Turning her head, she saw the valley, a vast, undulating expanse of white and gray that promised nothing but isolation. When she turned back, a man had materialized from the deep shadows of the porch. He was a towering presence, etched with the weariness of a life spent battling the elements. His hands were mapped with the thick, roped scars of unrelenting manual labor, and his eyes, dark and guarded, looked as though they had long ago surrendered the ability to trust anything moving on two legs. The parting venom of her brother-in-law, Marcus, continued to echo in the chambers of her mind, sharp as a whip crack. "You have dragged our name through the mire," he had sneered as he tossed her belongings into the dirt. "Let the recluse deal with your disgrace now. We are finished with you." Jacob, the man on the porch, observed her with the heavy lid of a man who had come to view every knock at his door as a harbinger of misfortune. Sarah, despite the trembling in her knees, tilted her chin upward. She refused to offer him the satisfaction of a plea or a tear. They stood there like two wounded predators across a clearing, each gauging the level of threat the other posed. "I didn't ask for this burden," Jacob finally muttered, his voice a low rumble that sounded like boots grinding over river stones. "Believe me, neither did I," Sarah countered, her voice tight but steady. His jaw flexed, a muscle leaping in his cheek. "Your kin are embroiled in some twisted game that I have no part of. I won't be a pawn in their schemes." A surge of white-hot fury roared through Sarah, more potent than the freezing wind. It wasn't just the cold making her shake. It was the realization that she had been discarded like refuse. Her husband's family, the very people who had sworn to protect her in her mourning, had instead transformed her grief into a weapon to exile her. Without looking her in the face, Jacob jerked a calloused thumb toward the outbuilding. "Take your rest in the barn. I'll determine what's to be done with you when the sun rises." Clinging to the tattered remnants of her self-respect, Sarah hoisted her trunk. She didn't wait for a second invitation or a helping hand. She marched toward the barn, her boots crunching rhythmically on the frozen earth. Behind her, the heavy timber door of the cabin groaned shut, the sound final and hollow. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of dried timothy hay, aged wood, and the warm, earthy musk of horses. With hands that would not stop shaking, she cleared a small space in the loft, spreading out her cloak to create a makeshift bed. Through the narrow chinks in the vertical siding, she could see the silhouette of the cabin. Jacob was a dark statue in his own doorway, his gaze fixed on the barn as if watching her very shadow. Sarah reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold metal of her late husband's wedding band. It was the solitary treasure his family hadn't managed to strip from her fingers. "I will outlast this winter," she whispered into the darkness, her voice a solemn oath. "And when the snow thaws, I will vanish so thoroughly that not even the memory of me will remain for them to haunt." She did not permit herself the luxury of weeping. Life had already taught her the brutal lesson that tears were a currency that bought no mercy. Nature, however, was indifferent to her resolve. On the 4th day of her exile, a monstrous blizzard descended, turning the world into a blinding vortex of white. Jacob found her later that evening, a slumped form nearly buried by the drifts against the barn's entrance. Her skin was a terrifying shade of blue-gray, her consciousness slipping into the easy, lethal sleep of the frozen. He spat a string of curses that were instantly devoured by the screaming wind. She had been too arrogant to knock on his door, too possessed by pride to ask for the warmth of his hearth, even as the cold began to shut down her heart. He recognized that brand of stubbornness. He had worn it himself like a suit of chainmail for 6 lonely years. Lifting her easily, Jacob carried her into the sanctuary of the cabin. He laid her before the roaring fire and began the painstaking process of forcing warm broth past her chattering teeth. Even in her semi-conscious state, she fought him feebly, her instinct for independence almost outweighing her instinct for life. The hours bled into one another. The only sounds were the rhythmic snap of burning cedar and the banshee wail of the storm against the logs. Slowly, the deathly pallor of Sarah's face gave way to a faint, flickering pink. When her eyes finally fluttered open and held his gaze, he saw a tumultuous war of humiliation and reluctant thankfulness. "Why did you bother?" she rasped, her voice as thin and brittle as dried parchment. Jacob poked at the embers, refusing to meet her eyes. "The winter doesn't consult us on our likes or dislikes. It simply kills. I'm not a murderer." Sarah pulled the heavy wool blankets tighter, her eyes roaming her new surroundings. The cabin was a study in austerity. It was a single, functional room, stripped of any ornamentation, smelling of wood smoke and the peculiar stillness of a place where no laughter had echoed for a very long time. It was a masculine fortress where softness had been systematically excised. "I have no intention of being a weight around your neck," she stated firmly. "Then see to it that you don't freeze to death on my doorstep again," he replied, his tone as flat as a card shark laying out a hand. He laid out the terms of their forced coexistence with cold precision. She would remain until the spring thaw made the mountain passes navigable. In exchange for room and board, she would take over the domestic labor, the cooking, the mending, the preparation of the spring garden. Come the first week of April, he would provide her with a mount and enough dry goods to reach a distant township where she could vanish and begin anew. Her family's long reach would not find her there. Sarah listened, her mind working like a ledger. This wasn't about trust, it was a contract of survival. "Your people won't take you back," Jacob added, his honesty brutal and unvarnished. "But you'll have a fighting chance somewhere else." "I accept," she said. "Good." That night, Jacob provided a bedroll near the fireplace without a word of ceremony. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, entombed the cabin in a fortress of snow. Inside, 2 ghosts occupied the same small square of warmth, both privately marveling at the strange, heavy silence of no longer being truly alone. In that quietude, the reality of their situation took root. They would either learn to cooperate, or the mountain would claim them both. Spring seemed like a fantasy from another life. 3 weeks into their arrangement, the shift began. Sarah was reaching for a heavy iron pot in the shadows of the rear cupboard when her fingers brushed against something smooth. She pulled it out, a small wooden horse, carved with such exquisite detail that she could feel the texture of the mane and the tension in its galloping legs. It had been handled so often its edges were polished. Jacob entered the room, his eyes instantly landing on the object in her hands. His face didn't just harden. It turned to granite. The air in the room grew thick and difficult to breathe. "My sons," he said at last, the words sounding as if they had been wrenched from his chest with pliers. "The fever took him 5 years ago. His mother followed shortly after." Sarah felt a sharp pang of empathy that made her throat ache. She replaced the toy with a sense of profound reverence, treating the wood as if it were spun glass. "My husband perished in a mine collapse 2 years back," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the memory. "His family laid the blame at my door. They were incensed that I hadn't produced a male heir before the accident. They claimed I was a carrier of misfortune, a curse. She looked him directly in the eye, refusing to flinch. They exiled me here because they felt I hadn't been broken enough by the grief. They called it providence, but it was nothing but sanctimonious cruelty. Jacob moved to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee with agonizing slowness. He handed one to her, the first truly human gesture he had offered that wasn't born of grim necessity. "And you permitted me to stay because you recognized the feeling," Sarah continued, "of being buried alive by the things we've lost." Jacob gave a single, somber nod. They sat at the rough-hewn table, their hands wrapped around the warmth of the mugs, the silence no longer a barrier but a shared space for their respective ghosts. That revelation acted as a catalyst. They could no longer view one another as mere obstacles or burdens. They were 2 people who had survived the same fire. Outside, the first tentative signs of a thaw appeared. The eaves began to drip, and the sun held a fraction more heat. Inside, something equally delicate was beginning to lose its frost. That evening, Sarah moved her bedding slightly closer to the center of the room. Jacob noticed, but his only response was a subtle softening of his expression. The barn door remained closed now, an invisible boundary having been crossed. The wooden horse was moved from the shadows to a prominent place on the mantel, no longer a secret of the dark. Lying in the dark, Sarah felt the cabin shifting in her mind. It was no longer a cage or a temporary waypoint. It was becoming something else. Something she wasn't yet brave enough to name. Across the room, Jacob stared at the ceiling, haunted by a thought that felt more dangerous than the winter. What if the spring comes and she doesn't go? April arrived not with a bloom, but with the chaotic, mud season, and the return of the sun's long arc. The valley began to show patches of emerald green, like a series of promises being kept. A domestic rhythm had settled between them. Sarah had transformed the neglected cabin, bringing order to the chaos and a sense of life to the dusty corners. In return, Jacob taught her the mechanics of his rifle. "Wolves and desperate men," he told her. "They don't care about your history." She proved an apt pupil, her hands steady and her eye keen. Small, quiet kindnesses began to accumulate like interest in a bank. She ensured his coffee was steaming when he returned from his morning rounds. He returned one afternoon with a cluster of wild crocuses, awkwardly placing them in a jar because the house looked a bit bleak. The tension broke entirely one evening when a particularly defiant hen escaped the coop, leading them on a frantic, ridiculous chase through the muddy yard. When they finally cornered the bird, they ended up leaning against the split-rail fence, breathless and laughing. The sound was so foreign to the valley that it seemed to startle the very trees. For a brief moment, the crushing weight of their pasts evaporated. Then came the sound of approaching hooves. Tom, the nearest neighbor from several miles down the trail, arrived with a wagon of supplies and a face full of judgment. He acknowledged Jacob with a curt nod but treated Sarah as if she were a blemish on the landscape. "Words traveled about your arrangement," Tom said, his voice heavy with implication as he unloaded sacks of grain. "The folks in town are talking. There's a lot of concern about the morality of it." Jacob's posture went rigid, his eyes flashing with a cold fire. "People are always remarkably concerned with business that doesn't belong to them. Just thought you should be aware," Tom continued, unperturbed. "Marcus has been making the rounds in town. His family has deep roots there, and he's been whispering in the wrong ears." After Tom's wagon disappeared, the warmth of the afternoon vanished as surely as if the sun had been snuffed out. Sarah stood by the window, her heart sinking. "I'm a contagion," she said softly. "I'll bring ruin to you just by being here. I should pack my things before your reputation is destroyed." Jacob remained silent for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the clock. When he spoke, his voice was a low, resonant hum. I stopped measuring my worth by the town's opinion 6 years ago. The real question is, what do you want, Sarah? She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. I don't know anymore. That night, she watched him through the glass as he labored under the moonlight, repairing fence posts with a patient, unyielding determination. She looked at her own reflection. The woman looking back was stronger, more vibrant than the ghost who had arrived in February. But a new fear took root, the fear that loving him would be the ultimate act of selfishness. The storm that night was different, a violent spring tempest. A crack of thunder like a cannon blast sent Sarah bolt upright, a scream tearing from her throat. It wasn't the lightning she feared, but the memory it triggered. Jacob found her huddled in a corner, trapped in a waking nightmare, her eyes wide but seeing a different tragedy. He hesitated, then sat beside her, his hand hovering before he finally rested it on her shaking shoulder. Sarah, look at me. You're here. You're in the cabin. You're safe. She lunged toward him, clinging to his shirt as the words poured out of her, the sound of the mine timber snapping, her husband's muffled cries beneath the earth, the suffocating silence of the aftermath. 2 years of repressed agony flooded the room. Jacob held her, his own voice a low anchor in the dark. The fever took them while I was away, he confessed quietly. I was 3 towns over delivering cattle. I came home to cold hearths and fresh mounds of dirt. Some nights, I still hear my boy's voice in the wind, calling for a father who wasn't there. The storm eventually rumbled into the distance. Dawn found them still sitting there, speaking of the guilt that refuses to die and the terrifying prospect of opening a heart that has been hollowed out by loss. I feel as though I am betraying Thomas by finding happiness here, she whispered into the gray light. Does that feeling ever go away? No, Jacob said with painful honesty. But you learn to carry the grief in one hand and the joy in the other. They can live in the same house if you let them. The morning light was soft, but the atmosphere between them was charged with a new, terrifying potential. That afternoon, while working the soil, their hands brushed as they reached for the same trowel. Neither pulled away. The connection was an electric current, a profound recognition of 2 souls choosing to heal together. The peace was shattered when Sarah spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. 3 riders were approaching, their silhouettes unmistakable. She knew that rigid posture, that air of arrogant authority. Marcus had arrived, flanked by 2 hired men with rifles slung over their saddles. They stopped in the center of the yard, the noon sun highlighting the malice in Marcus's features. You've brought further shame upon us, Marcus boomed, his voice a theatrical display of righteous indignation. Living as a concubine to this hermit. The family has deliberated. You will return with us. You will work the home farm under strict supervision. It is the only way to atone for your conduct. Jacob stepped forward, moving with a predator's grace to stand between Sarah and the riders. She owes you nothing but the dirt on her boots. She is a free woman. She is family property, Marcus snapped. And you're nothing but a recluse playing house with a dead man's widow. Sarah's voice was shaking, but it carried across the yard like a bell. I am staying here. You sent me to this mountain to suffer and die in the shadows. Instead, I found a life. I am not your property, Marcus. I never was. Marcus's face contorted with a dark, ugly rage. You think this failure of a man can protect you? He couldn't even keep his own wife and child from the grave. Don't you dare. Sarah stepped out from behind Jacob, her eyes blazing. Don't you dare use his tragedy to fuel your spite. The hired men shifted in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the confrontation. This wasn't the simple retrieval of a wayward relative they had been promised. "You'll regret this choice," Marcus hissed, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "The town will ensure you are driven out. I'll make it my personal mission to see you both destroyed." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his threats echoing in the still air. Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing, not out of fear of Marcus, but because she had finally, irrevocably cut the ties to her past. Jacob knelt beside her and, for the first time, pressed a gentle, deliberate kiss to her forehead. "We will face them together," he promised. "Whatever comes next." But as the sun beat down, the doubt remained. Had their love simply made them easier targets? The escalation began at midnight 2 days later. A brick shattered the window, a note tied to it with twine, "Sinners will burn." For 2 weeks, the world outside their valley became a hostile wasteland. The general store owner refused to sell them grain. The local congregation crossed the street to avoid their path. Even Tom stopped coming by. The isolation was no longer a choice, it was a siege. Jacob swept the shards of glass with a mechanical, grim precision. "Maybe I'm being selfish, Sarah. Maybe you'd be safer if you left me. I am not a stray you're keeping out of the rain." Sarah snapped, her fury ignited. "I chose this life. I chose you. Do not insult me by trying to take that choice away now." But in the dead of night, as she heard him boarding up the broken window, she wept silently. What if her presence was the very thing that broke him? She secretly packed a small bag, intending to slip away at dawn to spare him further misery. When the sun rose, however, she found Jacob already at work, his hand steady as he repaired the window frame. There was no surrender in his movements, only a quiet, iron-willed persistence. She realized then that if she ran, she would be destroying the very thing they had built. She unpacked the bag. They sat over breakfast and forged a plan. They would not hide. On Sunday, they would ride into town and face the community at the church. "If we do this," Jacob warned, "there is no turning back. It will be ugly." "Let it be," Sarah replied. "I'm done living in the shadows of their shame." The days leading up to Sunday were spent in a state of quiet resolve. Jacob practiced his words, and Sarah stitched a new dress out of a bolt of blue fabric she had saved, an armor of dignity. They spent the nights held tight in each other's arms, the silence no longer heavy, but sacred. The silence that greeted them as they entered the church was more deafening than any shout. Hand in hand, they walked down the center aisle, passing through a gauntlet of sneers and hissed insults. They took a seat in the final pew, the spring sun streaming through the stained glass. During the announcements, Marcus stood, his voice projecting to every corner of the room. "This woman is a disgrace to her marriage vows and our name. This man harbors her in open iniquity. It is a cancer upon this community, and it must be excised." Jacob rose slowly. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his voice was like a mountain stream, clear and unstoppable. Sarah's family threw her away like a broken tool. They wanted her to disappear into the cold. Instead, we built a life based on work, respect, and a shared burden. She brought me back from a living death. If that is a sin in your eyes, then condemn me. But she is a free woman, and she stays. Sarah stood beside him, her voice ringing out. "I loved Thomas with all my heart. His loss shattered my world. But his family tried to entomb me in that grief, using shame as a shroud. Jacob gave me back my future, not as a charity case, but as a partner. I choose him. I choose the home we have made." The elderly minister, a man who had seen more sorrow than most, spoke from the pulpit. "Who among us is without a scar? Who among us hasn't needed a second chance? Christ did not cast stones at the broken, he healed them. Who are we to deny peace to two people trying to mend? A wave of murmurs broke out. Several families stood and marched out in a show of protest, but others remained fixed in their seats. Tom's wife gave a small, supportive nod. The blacksmith stayed put. A widow in the corner was openly weeping. Marcus, seeing his influence slipping, lunged at Jacob with a guttural roar. They crashed into the pews, a blur of fists and ancient rage. The sheriff moved in quickly, prying them apart. "That's enough, Marcus," the sheriff barked. "They are adults on their own land. This vendetta ends today, or you'll be the one sitting in my cell." Marcus left the sanctuary with murder in his eyes, but he was legally defeated. Jacob and Sarah walked out into the blinding sunlight, bruised and bloodied, but undeniably whole. By late May, the land was a riot of extravagant green. The garden was thriving, a testament to their labor. It had been 6 weeks since the church, and while the town remained fractured, enough people had accepted them that they could live without fear. They had married in a quiet ceremony with Tom's family as witnesses. Not because they needed the town's permission, but because they wanted to mark their true beginning. The wooden horse now sat on the mantel, flanked by fresh wildflowers Sarah replaced every few days, a bridge between the children they had lost and the future they were building. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in hues of liquid gold, Sarah took Jacob's hand and placed it gently against her stomach. "We're going to have a child, Jacob." Tears welled in his eyes. A mix of profound joy and a lingering, human terror. "I'm frightened," he admitted. "So am I," she whispered. "But we'll do it together. We'll teach them that family isn't just about the blood in your veins, it's about who chooses to stand by you in the storm." They stood together on the porch, the warmth of the hearth behind them and the vast, promising land before them. "You are the greatest treasure I've ever known," Jacob murmured, pulling her close. "They meant it as a curse when they sent you here, but you became the greatest blessing of my life." Sarah smiled against his chest. "We saved each other. That's the truth of love, it isn't one person rescuing another. It's two broken people deciding to build something beautiful from the pieces." The sky turned to shades of violet and rose as the sun dipped below the peaks. Behind them, the fire continued to burn, steady and bright. Ahead, the garden grew in the twilight, the soil rich with the seeds of tomorrow. The wooden horse caught the last of the light, a silent witness to a winter that had ended and a life that had finally, truly begun. Home wasn't a place she had been born into, it was the life she had been brave enough to choose. If you enjoyed this story, you can show your love and support by subscribing to the Kindness Hour channel, liking, and sharing this video. And if you'd like to see your name featured at the top of our next story, drop your name and country in the comments below.